to everybody. Now we are opening the sixth event of Christian Philosophical Forum. And thankfully to Philosophical Society of Macedonia and also European Info Center. Also to some friends of ours, Costa. We have a very dear guest, and we are honored to have you on this philosophical forum. And we're going to enter this problem, this key concept, because we thought that it is good to have this, well, just shortly about the aim of this forum. It's about key philosophical concepts that are from Greek, mostly Greek origin, that reflect all history of philosophy on Western ground, but they reflected through Christian philosophical epistemological field, both Western and Eastern philosophy. And that's the aim of this forum, to reflect, to reconsider these key concepts of Western philosophy and culture. So we could say that the concept phenomenon, phenomenon, disturbs all Western philosophy and its metaphysical determination, but that exactly as such, I think it is a key concept that historically has influenced trans-temporal dimension of this unfinished philosophical reflection on the Western cultural ground. So I'm putting ancient Eastern philosophy aside due to the perspective of this forum and debate. Etymology. The Old Greek word purely means what appears, a fact, an occurrence, or observable circumstance. And in the philosophical proliferation, we might say that phenomenon is an appearance of immediate object of our awareness in the experience. But immediately, a question arises. What is a appearing thing? A dichotomy just springing up in history. We ask, is there another level of reality, some kind of noumenon, that could be the cause of the phenomenon, but ontologically it could never be the same thing? That's the question. Dichotomy, phenomenon, noumenon is dualistic implication, and maybe the first clear instance for this we could find in Platonistic view. Namely, the forms are noumena, and the things that appear in our senses are reflecting the forms because they are participating in them. Both. But how do we know what we know? First, do we know only the phenomena, in plural, or phenomenon? Appearing things or objects to our epistemological capacity, or maybe we know something else, something that appears in occurrence, but it keeps its completely ontological otherness during this appearance. It seems that to maintain this type of dualism, claiming that the phenomenon is an occurrence of the noumenon, and noumenon stays unreductible to its real appearance, is logically and epistemologically quite problematic. On what ground we claim such a thing? So, through a strong epistemological evidence, one could argue that we only speak about phenomena. We know only the reality of appearing objects, and there is no other reality beyond, as some kind of cause, because only one occurrence could be the place, the cause of another, due to the law of causality. Because contemporary problem, mind-body problem. There is no causality between different ontological orders. For instance, the question is how something physical causes something mental, or vice versa, some mental to cause some physical thing or event. So I think that this is logically stronger to say that we know only phenomena, and it is quite problematic to talk about this nominal reality. Maybe it's some kind of doubling the reality, but some kind of human construction of other reality that in reality does not exist. But how can we be sure that our capacity for knowledge as an epistemological border are also ontological border? That's the question that we address to this quite clear logical point of view, that we know only phenomena. Okay, we know only phenomena, and that is epistemological ground. But to say that because we know only phenomena exist, it's also problematic things, because epistemological border is not ontological border. And now I'm putting Kant into the discussion, because Kant just put a period in this relation between epistemological and ontological ground. According to Kant, we could only know the phenomena and their things as they appear to and are constructed by the mind. And they are distinguished from a nomenon or noumena, or as he states, thing in itself. We know only one side of the world as a thing for us, because we are not constructing the world. That's the clear difference. We are not constructing the world, but we simply constitute its appearing being. We translate the world that enters our mind, and we could never be able to speak about the world independently of our epistemological capacity, because we don't have sense data of such an intuition. Let's say if we have intuition, then we have world for us, and we would not know the world without knowing it. But we must assume the world as a thing in itself, and this clear epistemology guarantees the unreductiveness of the world inner being as a thing in itself. Always there will be a strong epistemological gap between the phenomena and noumena, but we must admit the existence of noumena. That's the implication of Kant's philosophy. So, do we have to be silent about this noumena and to ignore the metaphysical disposition of the human mind to ask questions about its nature, about the nature of this noumena? Naturally, disagreements just arise from this region of metaphysical and religious connotated discoursive, because we are not talking about an emotional thing, because the region of noumena is not only emotional thing. The religious is not only emotional. That's the stupidity of contemporary thinkers that say, okay, we are a rational being, but we have, due to the evolution, some unknown things, and that we invest emotion in them. So, the place for religion is there, but the religion is also a rational thing. And this area of nominal, it's absolutely rational. It's not only emotional. So, I think the disagreements arise from this region of religious connotated discoursive about the nominal thing, not about the phenomenal things. And I think also that maybe art and ethics are the best way to overcome this Kantian gap and its implication in the area of some kind of endless hermeneutics, because the horizon of human personality, humankind, is some kind of endless horizon of hermeneutics. So for now and for this interest, it's enough of me. So if I use some hip hop maneuver, I will say I pass the mic to.
Do I drop the mic?
To dear guest Jonathan Brown. Jonathan, please.
Well, thank you to Risto and Milan for the invitation to be here at the Christian Philosophy Forum, and also to Costa and Nada of the Balkan Institute for Faith and Culture, who have invited us to Macedonia for this week, the Oxford Connections program. Risto has given a brilliant introduction to some of the tricky academic and intellectual puzzles around the broader question of phenomenon, that which shows itself, and the specifics of the phenomenal and the noumenal, the noumena. I'm going to look at one very specific question related to this wider topic up here on the screen behind me. Can we encounter the divine through art and culture? And as we only have a few minutes, I'm going to really just give an introduction to this topic, to one person's way of thinking about it, and then perhaps we'll be able to go back in more detail as part of the discussion with you and the panel here later on. So I'd like to engage with the topic of the phenomenon, that which shows itself, by offering one positive answer to the question, can we encounter the divine through art and culture? Can the divine show itself, become a phenomenon in art? And we might just begin by noting that from the earliest human prehistory, cave paintings, through to the modern era, the next one, which is the Rothko Chapel in Houston, art and the human search for transcendence have always overlapped. They've always been linked. But today, by way of an introduction, I'd like to reference a much more recent work in a different medium, which is this film, Walk the Line. Has anybody seen that? It's a biopic of the musician Johnny Cash, and written and directed by James Mangold, with one scene in particular which engages, I think, with this question of encounter, of transcendence or the divine through art. And in this scene, Johnny Cash and his musical trio have contrived what for them is a potentially career-making opportunity to play and to sing for a hugely well-known producer. And they decide, because they're a bit worried and scared, to play safe and to play a very well-known religious gospel song that all of their audience at the producer would know. But at the end, as they're playing this song, the producer, Sam Phillips, in the film, turns to them and says, "I'm sorry, I can't market gospel anymore. I don't record material that doesn't sell, and gospel like that doesn't sell." And in the film, we see the musician Johnny Cash with the kind of rictus grin just sliding off of his face. And beneath it, we see an incredible raw passion. This is a man who thinks it's his destiny to sing. And so as the verbal interchange, the argument between Cash, the musician, and Phillips, the producer, goes back and forth, the director, James Mangold, uses a reverse shot sequence, getting closer and closer until all you see on the screen are back and forth between this huge image of Cash and a huge image of the face and Phillips. And as the tension ratchets up, the producer, Phillips, cuts loose. And he says to Johnny Cash, the musician, "If you were hit by a truck and you were lying out in the gutter dying, and you had time to sing one song, one song that people would remember before your dirt, one song that would let God know what you felt about your time here on earth, are you telling me that gospel song that everybody knows is the song that you would sing? Or would you sing something different, something real, something you felt? Because I'm telling you right now that that's the kind of song that people really want to hear. That's the kind of song that truly saves people." And so Cash is stunned, and over the objections of his band, he launches into a song of his own making. And immediately, and for the first time, there's a harsh, raw authenticity to what he's singing. The camera is still zoomed in tight on these two characters, but while Phillips is shown staring straight into the camera as though he's paying attention to Cash and the music, Cash, the musician, is shown with his face contorted, his eyes skewed away from the camera, and the viewer is confronted with the dislocated stare of the sightless, the petit mal of the epileptic, or perhaps conceivably the ecstasy of the saint. Phillips taunted Cash, challenged him to produce something with real relevance, with real bite. Phillips wanted truth with a small t, existential, human truth. He wasn't interested in truth with a capital letter, religious dogma that he considered domesticated by the church, rendered to. The question today is, are these two truths parallel lines, or might they intersect? Can the finite break through to the infinite? Can human cultural creation be revelatory, not just because it incidentally mirrors narratives or truths of scripture and tradition, but because its very human authenticity, its aesthetic power, enables the hearer or the viewer to encounter something of the capital T truth of the design? Phillips, the producer, seemed to think so. That's the kind of song that truly saves people. So turning from illustration to theory, a German immigrant to the United States, a philosopher and theologian called Paul Tillich, who was quite possibly sitting at his desk in New York when Johnny Cash was singing for Sam Phillips in 1953, thought that human artistic production, art and culture could give on to the divine. He was a Lutheran pastor, a World War I chaplain, a young professor of philosophy at Frankfurt, where he would supervise Theodor Adorno in his second doctoral thesis and worked with the Frankfurt School. He fled to Germany because of his opposition to the Nazis. He became the president of Harvard University, and unusually, if you go through two, here we go, we'll finish. Next one, made it onto the cover of Time, which theologians rarely do. But he believed, in fact, the religious, spiritual, divine power of culture was the focus of Tillich's interest from the very beginning. On the idea of a theology of culture was his first published speech, and his belief that the finite world, natural and cultural, could mediate the infinite predates his academic career. Even as a child, a romantic disposition opened him to mystical experiences engendered by nature, poetry, and literature. And in his autobiographical essay on the boundary, he reflects on the close relationship between the religious and the cultural. He says this: if a person who had been deeply moved by the mosaics of Ravenna, the ceiling paintings of the Sistine Chapel, or the portraits of the older Rembrandt were asked whether his experience had been religious or cultural, he would find the question difficult to answer. It might be correct to say that the experience is cultural in form and religious in substance. It's cultural because it's not attached to a specific ritual act, but it's religious because it touches on the question of the absolute and the limits of human existence. And Tillich himself privileged one personal experience of revelation through culture above all others. I've already said he was a chaplain during the First World War in the horrors of the front line in many of the bloodiest, muddiest battles. And he used to console himself in the dugout by the light of a candle with a book of the great works of art of Western culture. But those small, cheap reproductions in dim light were nothing compared to confrontation with the originals. And on furlough from the war, he visited the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin and stood transfixed by Botticelli's Madonna with Singing Angels. And he wrote this: in the beauty, again, small b, of the painting, there was beauty, capital B, itself. Something of the divine source of all things came through to me. I turned away shaken. That moment has affected my whole life. given me the keys for the interpretation of human existence, brought vital joy and spiritual truth. I compare it with what is usually called revelation in the language of religion. It was experiences like these that led Tillich to theorize that as religion is the substance of culture, so culture is the form of religion, and to prioritize the breakthrough in his account of revelation. And in what follows, I will just set out very, very briefly the way in which he used his philosophical understanding to analyze these kinds of experiences. And he considered 6 aspects of the experience of encounter with the divine through an artwork, through a cultural medium. He talked, final slide. He talked about the individual who is the subject of the experience, the artwork, which is the medium, the mechanism of the event, the content of what is revealed, the effect of the revelation, the experience. And then as a Christian thinker and theologian and philosopher, he thought about the relationship of that experience of revelation to Jesus as the Christ. And I think because we're doing a form of introduction and discussion, I'm going to leave it there, and perhaps later on we can dig down into the different parts of that explanation of what goes on in this moment of encounter between a human person and an object of art, and the potential for a breakthrough to an experience of transcendence and the divine.
Obviously, he is in some kind of revelation condition.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan, for your input. I also would like to give the credits to everybody who contributed to this event today, especially to 2 persons, to Ljubčo, the president of the Philosophical Society of Macedonia, and to Costa, the director, I guess, or president of the Balkan Institute for Faith and Culture. So, welcome from me as well. Before I give the word to our next speaker, I would just like to turn the focus to a group of topics which I think that would be very helpful as an introduction to the following things we're going to hear. So, and in the last years, we experienced one very specific media culture and media phenomenon. And that is the phenomenon of crossed information. We have very different informations in the media, especially thanks to the internet, to all the openness of the contemporary communication system, system of media and informations and similar. So we have a lot of examples for this. And at some moment I just have the experience, I just have the impression that we take part, or that we are actually seeing one global reality show. And that is what we experience, what we see in front of us, what we experience with our senses in front of us. So we have a lot of brutality, a lot of things we see in the media, from the information, including the information from the WikiLeaks or everything we see on the TV, on different TV channels? Should we have the same events with completely different interpretations? So I just have the feeling that not only the concept of post-truth is the central problem we talk about, but it is maybe a concept of some post-ethics. We lose the feeling for what is good and what is wrong. We lose the intuition to judge what is right, what is righteous, and what is not righteous. So we see all the brutality, and we are like the Romans on the sides of the big arena, watching all the brutality of the world on one place. So this is maybe a topic that can be like introductory to what we'll hear further. And I think that there is another topic that is also very important, and this is a topic about cynicism, with which we observe this reality. I think that the cynicism is maybe the approach one has when one person is exposed to all this gross information we receive from the media, we receive from including the internet, etc. So all these contradictory messages do not come from different, different sites. Like you have the, you have the CNN, and then you have the Russia Today, then you see both media. No, you have the cross messages coming from the same sources. Like a typical example, I would say, is the President Donald Trump's tweets. Like you see the tweets, and you have completely each of them contradicts the previous one. So it's not that simple that we have different sources giving different signals, but we have the same sources giving all these different signals and making a total confusion. So my question: if this is one such discourse, I would call it a discourse, a proof of the lack of rationality in today's times, or a lack of contact with the phenomenological reality. And I would say no, on the contrary, I would say it is the rationalism at its purest. It is the rationalism freed from any transcendence, which brings the rationality itself to irrationalism. And in order to understand this in itself seemingly contradictory claim, I would go to G.K. Chesterton. In his Orthodoxy, he has an amazing place where he speaks about the belief as the founding exception of rationality. If rationality stands alone, then it will destroy itself, and it will go to complete irrationality. So I think that there is a point here which may introduce us to the further discussion, which our next guest, Christopher David Wander. So I give the mic as well to you. Same as this one.
Thank you, and I echo Jonathan's thanks to you both and to Costa and Nada and the Balkan Institute for hosting us this week. I should say I'm very much a theological ethicist rather than a philosopher, so I hope that doesn't disappoint the philosophers among you too much. But I do have a story to tell you about someone with a doctorate in philosophy who did a course with me explaining and examining the basic concepts of Christian faith. And this woman was a phenomenologist, and when she began dating her husband, he was a Christian, she was not. And he said to her, well, this difference in faith, this is a thing between us, isn't it? And she said, well, I'm a phenomenologist and I don't really believe in things. But this was the beginning of their relationship, and they were married and they had children, and he brought them to church. And in the end, she decided to do this course, the Alpha course, explaining Christian faith, even though she really wasn't sure that God could ever be perceived. And after about week 4 of this 10-week course, she said to me, "Christopher, I've got a terrible confession to make. You know how I've said that I don't really believe in things. Well, this week I've begun to believe in tables and chairs, and I'm just not sure where this might lead." And she became a Christian. So anyway, there was this tussle with engaging with the conceptual world and what is the place of the numinous, if you like. I was a BBC journalist for 8 years, then trained for ordination in the Church of England, and now work in Oxford. And what I particularly want to explore this morning is the way in which the practice of Western journalism, as we've received it, in a sense, prior to the advent of social media in particular, the notion of reporters actually going somewhere and finding something out and then conveying it back to a mass audience, something, of course, which is now under threat in so many different ways. That this practice of journalism is founded, if you like, on an implicit engagement with revealed truth. And postmodernity, in so many ways that we've already heard of, is challenging that very conceptual foundation for, at best, the practice of journalism. So you might say that free journalism is founded on the free pursuit of objective truth. But as we have heard, in the Trump post-truth fake news era, that notion of objective truth, which even though journalism has been a very secular and secularised pursuit, nonetheless it has been founded on a very clear pursuit of truth, which is now itself under threat. And I should say as an aside that of course most working journalists would have little time at a surface level, at least, for this kind of discussion. They would simply say, well, you know, the bomb has dropped, it was an evil act, and I need to report it. And they may not stop to pause to analyse, well, what is the objective fact that has occurred that they really can conceptualise? What is perhaps the more numinous aspect of it, which they may seek equally confidently to label as evil or whatever else. But I think actually, interestingly, often when journalists step back from the war zone or the front line, as it were, they do find themselves wanting to ask these deeper questions. And I think particularly now, actually, that the kind of 20th century craft of journalism is so much under threat in a very new and immediate way. We are in a cultural moment where suddenly these questions become quite pressing. So I want to frame my thoughts in relation to some of the truth claims made in the Gospel of John, a gospel which, among the 4 Gospels, is uniquely fascinated by the concept of truth. And of course, as will be familiar to many of you, you know, it begins with this reference, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. We inhabit this Christian tradition where objective truth is utterly foundational. I am the way, the truth, and the life. But for journalists, I do think there are some tantalising concepts here. To the Jews who believed in him, this is chapter 8, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And during my years as a Christian journalist, which some people felt was a kind of fairly oxymoronic lifestyle, but nonetheless I tried to do it. Often Christian leaders would challenge the practice of journalism, would recoil from the opportunity to answer an awkward question. But often this was the verse that I would quote back to them. If you really believe that the truth sets free, you might think about should light be hidden under lampstands or other examples. Then should the Christian be at all fearful of truth, and indeed therefore the practice of journalism? Because if ultimately that which is hidden is worthy of being disclosed, if truth is the bedrock of all that is good and life-giving, then even if the truth is sometimes uncomfortable, one shouldn't necessarily be afraid of that truth being shared. Within the Church of England at the moment, we are living through a kind of prime example of this, in that the national sex abuse inquiry that is being undertaken in the UK, looking at the problem of sex abuse, particularly in relation to children in a number of institutional settings, has begun with a diocese of the Church of England and its handling of some terrible sex abuse cases. The timing of this was, you might almost say heaven sent. I'm sure that the inquiry timetablers had no idea, but of course it meant that the Archbishop of Canterbury was appearing in Holy Week to kind of deal with these horrendous truths. But ultimately, it seems to me that the Church of England will only be set free from this horrible past if it faces and owns and allows light to be shone on the truth of this situation. Jesus, teaching Nicodemus in John chapter 3, says, "This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God." And although journalists may well recoil from the principle that there is a kind of all-seeing sight of God at work, the earlier part of that verse I think can quite clearly be seen to be a kind of undergirding principle for the best of contemporary journalism. Truth comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly what they have done. But of course this necessitates a very strong, emphatic appeal to the existence of truth in the world. The whole practice of journalism, I would suggest, being predicated on the notion that untruth needs to be challenged and truth, however uncomfortable, needs to be exposed. I would suggest, for example, that the aftermath of the awful domestic tower fire, the Grenfell Tower in London last year, where over 70 people died, the practice of journalism has been one very important factor in a civil society coming to terms with that and uncovering the truth of the factors that led to that tragedy. I'm not saying that journalism is the only actor in that. There will be a public inquiry which will also be important, and there will be prosecutions and other kinds of legal cases that will follow. But there is a role for journalism as one significant actor in civil society. In case this risks being a kind of paean to journalism, I will finish with a very brief satirical poem by Humbert Wolff, a British civil servant who died in 1940, who did a great line in satirical poetry, and one of his most famous poems is simply entitled "The British Journalist." "You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist. But seeing what the man will do unbribed, there's no occasion to. I hope that I'm not presenting a needlessly rosy picture of either the reality or at least the potential of journalism, though I did take the pay of the BBC for 8 years, and therefore, obviously I was as near to journalistic truth as it's possible to be. But I do believe that this Christian philosophical, theological notion that the truth sets free is a profound truth that actually in the practice of journalism, Christian civilization, if you like, has offered to the increasingly secular West, but it is now very profoundly under threat. And so even though this concept of truth can seem elusive, I do believe that it's foundational to the concept of journalism at its best.
Thank you. Before we announce the second block, I will just begin directly with a little question. Like you mentioned the word postmodern. That we live in the postmodern situation. I just have the impression that the postmodern period was finished somewhere in the 90s, I would guess, and that we are now experiencing the day after the hangover. Yeah? So, do you share this opinion, and how do you approach this?
Jonathan may also wish to contribute. I certainly one hears discussion that are we now in a postmodern?
Yeah, that was the question. Is there a post to postmodernism?
I think for me, I suppose that the beginning of some kind of free-for-all that you might identify with postmodernism has simply intensified. And perhaps the advent of social media has brought this, to each of our handheld devices in a way that gives it a kind of immediacy. But I think behind the semantics is perhaps a new and deepening sense of the sheer fluidity of gender, of sexuality, of whether nations have a value. I mean, I feel, I was just looking for the Union Jack among the European flags. Brexit, in a sense, is another symptom of this kind of new searching for identity, for value. So it's kind of ironic as a British man to be in the kind of promotional centre for the European Union a year away from Britain's departure. So I think for me it's about a collapse of foundations in many contexts, and in a sense therefore the place of potentially of philosophy, certainly for theological endeavour to try and hold and curate something of that and speak effectively into culture.
But isn't that what is broken with humanity itself? And then we have a lot of us, I think speak about not postmodernism but posthumanism. And we have all this technology putting its own standards, and we kind of forget. We have to replace the old standards about truth, about good and evil, about right and wrong, etc. With the new standards given from the technology. So it's not the human and humanity understood in the classic philosophical Christian way, which gives the standard, but proclaim is some new standard. Yeah? So.
Well, because Jonathan implied some interesting topics about and also with Christopher is about the subjective and objective truth, because according to Kant, any revelation must be judged by the pure reason, because Kant probably knew that every religious experience of some kind of revelation of noumenal world, it's problematic in terms of ethics and in terms of media, of experience that could be mediated in the terms of ethics and in the terms of universal. So I think that maybe Wittgenstein, I found the Wittgenstein very Kierkegaardian thinker, more than in sense of analytical philosophy, because for Wittgenstein the meaning of the world is outside of the logical net of our mind to the world, and about that thing we must be silent. So Kierkegaard said that in the art and in the religion we are not dealing with objective truth, but we are dealing with subjective truth, and that's the nominal thing of or essence of existence, because in the sphere of existence we are quite subjective, and we are dealing with differential things, but not with unified essence. So it's Kierkegaard versus Kant. So about this revelation in art, and because the individual is the subject of this experienced revelation in art, but how we could, I don't know, to build some communion on this type of revelation in art, and in this subjective way of experience revelation, because it's quite problematic. I think that I will be on the side of Kierkegaard. I think it's also subjective, but how to get this, because I don't know, it's something like that. Some person that is sensitive, he watched some movie of Terrence Malick, and he experienced the revelation of some divine nature. But other person said, well, I experienced nothing. So, yes.
So if I can keep my thoughts in order, I'd like to make a general comment about your first point about Kant and pure reason, which relates to postmodernism, I think. And then the specific question about subjective, objective, in the moments of revelation, where I'll refer back to Tillich and his approach. So in terms of, I think one of the really helpful things about postmodern philosophy, if not about postmodernism as a cultural thing, was recognizing that when Kant talks about pure reason, it's the reason of an 18th century Prussian intellectual in a Western Enlightenment tradition. And lots of people simply don't share that account of what the human is, or what reason is. And I think that postmodernity very, very helpfully, or postmodernism's, the philosophy very helpfully uncovered the way in which, a lot of these universal claims are actually the claim of whoever happens to be in power intellectually or politically at the time. And so I think that was a very helpful part of postmodernism. I think at one level was to say, actually, we need to think about these claims which we're making for pure reason, as opposed to anything else in the way in which we think about things. And now, exactly as Christopher said, I think what we're living at the moment in the early 21st century is the hangover of the intellectual movement of postmodernism, when it's all broken down into each person not having any idea of what it is to be human and what we live by. And so to come back then, after that general point, to revelation and the possibility of revelation through art or culture, or for that matter through a religious text, scripture, the Bible, because that's also, different people have different experiences and find different things in that, so it doesn't really matter whether it's a cultural artifact or a religious tradition. The fact is, as you say, that different people experience those things in different ways. And so I'll simply tell you the way in which Paul Tillich tries to get around that, is that he doesn't talk about the experience of revelation. He talks about the event of revelation, the Ereignis, in the sort of his German form. And what he's wanting to say that it's neither purely subjective nor objective, it's the coming together of two constellations. The constellation of the human person's experiences up to that point, and the constellation of what has been breathed into that work of art, if that's what we're talking about, by its creator. And it's only when you have a particular alignment of those two distinct constellations that you get an event, a moment of revelation. And I don't think that that's, sort of completely satisfactory. But I think that what it does do is give you, some language for being able to explain why it is that different people have different experiences without having to reduce it purely to the subjective level. So for the human individual, to come back to your Kierkegaard, Tillich in the latter half of his career is considered an existentialist. Obviously, he was very much of that flow of thought, and so he believes that revelation is almost always a result of anxiety, of a lack of understanding and confusion, and precisely this kind of desire for a truth which can't just always be explained away by the next level down of explanation, something which is real. And so it's only when for some reason the human person has that desire, that quest he talks about a lot, that longing for something more, that they're ready for an event of revelation. And on the other hand, with artwork, he talks about what it is that is uniquely human, as opposed to animal or mineral or, for that matter, spiritual purely. What is human, are those areas of life where the human spirit, again, small s is involved. And he talks about culture, morality, and religion. And in those dimensions of spirit, he believes that the human artist, for want of a better word, is infusing into that work of art something of the human spirit, and that there is the potential there of depth, the connection to what we might call the divine spirit. And so again, so you have an artwork which is potentially infused, potentially has the depth that gives on to the divine. You have the human person who's desiring, questing, driven by anxiety and confusion towards something ultimate. And when those two things happen to engage, then you have a moment of revelation. But he's also a very, very strong believer in mystery, that the divine is always a mystery. It's not like a puzzle. It's not something that once you solve it, then you have all your neat answers. It will always remain inexhaustible. Links into the apophatics of the tradition of theology. There are always things which you can't say in a positive sense, and therefore there's you wouldn't expect to be able to reduce that event to a set of this is what happened and this is what it meant. There's going to be a mystery on the side of the divine, and there's going to be particularity on the side of the human.
Maybe this the notion of wholeness. Kant also speaks about this wholeness, the notion of wholeness, but it's only on epistemological level, because we do not have wholeness of ontology, because the world is not finished, because it's lasting, it's something that happens, and we do not have wholeness of the world, and that's why maybe the anxiety of angst, that the term of Kierkegaard is good, because we are facing with unfinished world, and maybe this the art is maybe the art is key to understand the world. Maybe the world is some kind of artwork, because it's unfinished, and I will put some. And I will finish with this, because the old Christian philosophers, they do not have such a notion that we are that we construct some noumenological we double the reality. because what is with mathematics? For instance, one thing, it's not only what it appears, because we see the laws of mathematics in this thing. So it's not nomenological that we construct, but it's in this appearance of phenomenology. For instance, I have in mind Maximus the Confessor, and he's teaching about logos, tropos, and hypostas. This is hypostasis of tropos, of logos, of the things. So we do not have double reality, because we do not say that I don't know, the mathematics is outside of the world, this world, that we maybe our minds realizes the mathematics, but the mathematics, this thing is here because of mathematics, because of that nominal laws of this world. So it's not doubling reality. It's not. There is no dualistic. There is no dualism. Only this world exists.
Yeah.
So
that element of discovery. It's not just invention, but that we discover things. And mathematics is a very interesting example of that.
okay.
I just looked at the watch, and we have already 1 hour behind us. So I think we can open the third part, the discussion with the audience, everybody here present. So if you have any questions or comments you have, you can just raise your hand, and like on the example here. So please.
Yes, okay. So my first question is for Mr. Jonathan Brandt. How do you see the role of the hope? Because in the antique world, the hope was considered a bit to thing that will make you weak, manipulate. On the other hand, the Christianity emphasizes the hope. And it seems that art gives a lot of hope, because we see that our bodies die, and art, sometimes it lives forever or longer than this. So do you think that this role of comprehension of Christianity versus art and culture can be done by the hope? And the second question is for His Excellency. Sorry, what was your name? Your Excellency.
Christopher.
His Excellency.
Typically, that's possible.
Sorry, my eyes and my glasses are not. What I want to say that I don't have a quick. I would like actually a little debate, because I don't think that in the previous period we were having a lot of information. We had only one source of information, and that was the government. And it is our guilt. We are guilty because we let it happen, because the government was deciding what can be published and what not, and what can be available and what not. And I don't think that the contemporary media and the new technologies can be blamed for this, because we all let it happen. It was a bad thing, and we let it happen. And that's why now we're still confused. We don't know what is good or bad, because there are a lot of people from the previous administration and all this stuff that works for the statal bodies that are still employed. So I would challenge you on this, and would you elaborate this for me if you can? And the third is for Mr. Christopher Orlando, and how do you think, would you agree with my paraphrase that according to Kant, truth and reality are different in a sense that truth in different time, because he has time, he emphasizes the role of time, truth in different time can be different reality, and in a reality in a different time, we can see the truth the other way. So I think this can tackle the question about about the role of art and culture, and also it matters what kind of culture. There is a positive and there is a negative culture. There are progressive and regressive social movements.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hope seems to be a theme of our conversations. Today we had one conversation about hope, and it's interesting because two of my closest colleagues that I work with back in Oxford have both just in the last few years written their doctorates on specifically hope. It's clearly, an important topic of the moment, and in both cases what they're trying to do is to recover an understanding of hope, and they would say a more theological Christian understanding of hope as a virtue. And what they mean by that is that when we think of hope today in our sort of normal culture, we tend to think of it as a kind of optimistic feeling, a feeling that everything's going to turn out all right, things will turn out good. But that doesn't really allow for the reality, of the world around us. And so they're trying to find a way of talking about hope, which is, like all virtues, is a medium between kind of naive optimism, sort of Panglossian, optimism on the one hand, and sort of despairing pessimism on the other. So hope is something which sees the world as it really is, recognizes the challenges and the difficulties and the pain and the suffering, doesn't think that things are just automatically going to get better, but nonetheless sees something in the future to hope in. And obviously for Christians that's hope in something, it's hope in God, in the eventual coming of the kingdom of God, the consummation of all things in God through Christ. So I think if we move from that to talk about art, that again can be a helpful lens and way of assessing the value of art, is can it hold those two things in tension? So it's not purely idealistic that pretends that everything is as it should be and everything is happy in the world, because that's ridiculous. But nor does it merely focus on all that is broken and ugly and disconnected in the world, but somehow holds those two things together. Clearly, it may not be possible to do that in any one individual work of art, but in somebody's body of work, in the understanding of art in a nation or an institute or whatever, you may be able to hold those two things together. And fun enough, again, it's something which Paul Tillich worked on a lot, and he worked on the basis of what he called beliefful realism. And I think you could put that as a kind of a hoping realism. So it's something which looks at the world in all of its mess and ugliness and everything that the journalist sees, and doesn't try to skim over that, but is willing to face up to the reality of all that is ugly, and yet continue to have belief and hope that that's not the end of the story, that there may be something more and that we can work towards it. So I think hope is a really interesting sort of key to think about these things, albeit not something that I've worked on myself. So thank you.
So certainly as I travelled around the world for the BBC, one of the misconceptions was that necessarily as a state-funded broadcaster you were therefore not editorially independent, and for the BBC that is the case, which seems paradoxical and even unrealistic from the perspective of many people internationally. So it is certainly the case that the BBC is a state-funded broadcaster with complete editorial independence, is a very different kind of state broadcaster. So say from many that one sees around the world. And of course, Russia today is in a sense, well, not in a sense, it is a very clear example of the way in which a state will still use soft power via the media in a way which is still mechanistically taxpayers' money, investing in the media in the way that happens for the BBC. But I would still try and make a defence for saying that the output is different in kind. But I do agree with you that if you look at the social media landscape, we all bear some collective guilt in allowing this to happen. My personal view is that in 30 or 40 years' time, future generations will be saying to us kind of, what were you thinking in relation to both perhaps the surrender of personal data, the waste of time, and indeed the kind of sheer lack of humility associated with social media. We ran a course for Christians in London called How Do You Raise Your Social Media Profile Without Losing Your Soul? And it was very attractive to people because they recognised that there was this kind of this danger of a kind of sapping of one of the key virtues associated with Christianity. How would Jesus have used Instagram or whatever? I'm no expert on Immanuel Kant, and so I don't want to pretend to be. But I would simply make, I suppose, a more journalistic observation about the growth of Pentecostalism, for example, around the world, as a branch of Christianity, which is presumably attractive because it is unashamed about its pursuit of the inexplicably numinous, if you like. And of course the Orthodox tradition has always maintained this very high view of the Holy Spirit, and in a mainline Western kind of Protestant denomination like Anglicanism, my own tradition, the recovery of the place of the numinous is one of the places where you see growth. I mean, ironically, in an Anglican setting, in both more Catholic and more kind of quasi-Pentecostal settings, but both, I think, flourish because they are seeking to try and marry together an appeal to the inexplicable with a theological coherence, which can seem inherently paradoxical, but which I think at the level of what is actually appealing to people's spirit, that is part of the kind of observable reality of where churches are growing or not, which is probably not to answer your question, but I've had a go. Okay, thank you.
Good. Now we have our next question. Victor, please.
Thank you. I'd like to briefly take issue with the very idea of art being able to reflect divinity or the divine, and of course would like to be maybe persuaded that I'm wrong. So it is the only, surprisingly, it's been only recently that I realized that the most genuine sacral object that give rise to religious awe, let's say, are all man-made, and not only that, but perhaps erected on the expense of lots of sweat, blood, and maybe, you know basically what I mean. So they do evoke these religious feelings, but they might be kind of displaced because it is a human product. So why wouldn't we, for example, if we seek for the divine, why wouldn't we take the Platonic way and see directly in nature? If we want to discern the beauty itself, why wouldn't we start with the ascent process of the symposium and see it in the single beautiful body, for example? Then in nature or yeah, I mean, we can ascend, of course, the stair of a realization of the beautiful. So that would be my kind of confusion. And also, I would suggest if we do want to experience divine through art, why wouldn't we go to music? Because it uses kind of universal language like mathematics does, and it's as incorporeal as an art form can be. So thank you.
Wonderful, brilliant question. So I think first of all, and again, I'm not going to, I think, be able to remember, let alone respond to each aspect of your question, but to begin with, revelation of the divine. The Christian tradition, and actually on this account Paul Tillich, are very clear that the ultimate revelation of the divine is in the person of Jesus Christ, whom obviously not incidentally is a human. It's a human manifestation. So, there are millions of things we can say about that, but at the very least, the tradition has always said that we most clearly see the divine revealed in the human person. So whenever you pick a particular aspect of revelation, as I say, if I'd gone through, you would have finished with that, the revelation in Jesus as the Christ. And I think, therefore, you would say by analogy, not least because of the words of Jesus himself, that the next place that you're going to encounter the divine is amongst us, one another. That is a natural place to encounter God, because I think the human is much closer to the divine. It's in the image of the divine in a way which no work of art is in the same way. Then, so I'm giving you a kind of assent here. But then, nature as well, as the work of the great artist, the work of God, infused in a way, again, which we don't understand, but again, in which Orthodox theology has been hugely influential, even in the West in the last century, recognizing that the Spirit of God is abroad and at work in the world beyond just, the institution of the church or the place where the gospel is preached, but God is at work in his world, is present in his world as well. So I think all of those are probably more, to use the word natural, more likely places to encounter the divine than art. Nonetheless, I wouldn't want to draw a line that says simply, once you've gone beyond the human person, once you've gone beyond the natural world, and now we're down to things which human beings have created, you can't experience the divine. I think you can also there. And I think the final part of your question comes back to what we were discussing before in relation to hope, the state of the world in general, is that human artifacts, human persons, human artifacts, human cultures, societies, nations, institutions are always in this current age going to be mixed, of good and evil. If God could only reveal himself through that which is perfect, we would have Jesus Christ and nothing else. Fortunately, God is, I believe, generous and gracious enough to reveal himself through a much broader spectrum of things beyond our understanding. And I think that can include art. However, I think that hopeful, beliefful realism requires that we look at how were these cathedrals which we enjoy in the United Kingdom and here in other parts of the world, how were these built? Who was subjugated in order to raise those walls up? Whose glory was this really built for? I think those are important questions. So I think it's a very helpful question, but I'd certainly want to clarify by saying I'm by no means saying that art is the only or even the primary location of encounter, but I think we shouldn't rule it out.
The Orthodox was just mentioned, and before that, Risto mentioned some, we said it is a holistic approach, I think. Yeah? So, that's right, there is a strong underlying charismatic dimension in the Orthodox way and in the Orthodox approach toward Christianity, toward the Christian way of life, but it is undividable, it is indivisible, it cannot be divided from the other dimensions of Orthodox Christianity. And it is the dogmatic, so it is the doctrine, then it is the legalistic, it is the church law, and then it is the liturgical. It is the divine service and way of making the divine service, including the sacraments, etc. So all these elements are connected one to another. If one grows stronger than the others, then it has already a problem to within Orthodoxy. You know, so there are many historical examples when we can see that some of these dimensions of Christianity was trying to be the first before the others, but then we have historical and theological problems in the church history. Practically, we have the idea is when the idea is not simply charismatical or simply juridical or simply orthodox in the sense of dogmatically right, etc. But much more there is this concept of Catholicity within Orthodox theology, which is translated to a very interesting word, and very word which is saying a lot in the Slavic languages. It is the word svobodnost. Catholicity comes from katholon. It does not mean, in this translation, this way of approach of Catholicity, it does not mean the world church, the church of the whole world or of every place on the world, but it means that church which has everything in itself. And when we say everything, the everything means everything from all these different dimensions into one whole. So I think that this refers to what Risto said on Orthodox theology and the way these different dimensions fit into the one. Yeah?
Yes, but we could apply also that to art. I think that one Russian philosopher, Solovyov, about because Hegel had a broad influence on Russian philosophy, religious philosophy, the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. But Solovyov said that art continues, nature stops. That's not the Hegelian way, because you put that nature and art, they have the same essence about creation. It's all about creation. So I think that every church is some kind of gathering, and in the essence it's all creation. That's why I think that this area of conversation about the noumenon is some kind of creation. It's conversation, it's hermeneutics, and all humankind we gather and we talk about these things about that differ us, but also they unite us in some kind of endless horizon of these philosophical topics. So.
But anyway, I would like to add also Kierkegaard has a much stronger influence through Bergerac. And Kierkegaard is you can cognize the world only when you don't have anything. So how will you? And it is evident that this, even now, it has a strong influence in this region, Bergerac. So how will you now? I don't think that your observation is precise. How will you explain now through this approach the role of the art and culture?
Well,
perhaps the culture will be to help the others because they don't have any.
No. Well, we're gonna. Probably it's gonna be a lecture, and I don't want to lecture now. The influence of Hegel is strong with religious thought of Russians, but because of the Christianity, and specifically Orthodox Christianity, that's why Bergerac is close to Kierkegaard. So we have Kierkegaard and we have Hegel in Russian religious thought, but okay, it's
we have another question. Mr. Gaidov, please.
we are very much obliged to Dr. Milkov for this very good discussion. And when I was preparing for this meeting, I thought we should have only 4 paradigms: philosophy, religion, art, and science. But Dr. Landau involved my first profession, journalism. I don't know whether he is a follower of the greatest British journalist and statesman, Sir Winston Churchill, because he said, journalism the best job in the world, but the great wisdom is to know when to quit. I don't know whether Dr. Landau went into philosophy through journalism or otherwise. On my first lecture by Professor Russell at Cambridge, he said, we philosophers and you journalists have 2 things in common. We have to pursue ethics, and we are champions of questions. So, ancient Indian philosophers and ancient Greek philosophers started with questions: what is behind appearance? What is behind phenomenon or phenomenon? Ionians, Pythagoras, Athenians, they answered at first arche, source, spring, principle. Second, they answer aition, or cause. But today, we journalists have great competition with social media, where everybody is journalist today. And this, I said, globalization and digitalization made a lot of noise, and people stopped thinking about the cause behind appearance. Today, this small session here in Schopenhauer style, better 10 than 1,000, means that posing question on the relations primarily between philosophy and religion, to my mind, is not only questions, but this is ethics, since Aristotle, through Kant and modern philosophers, only ethics is linked between religion and philosophy. For example, Freud said nobody could compete religion, because behind scientific explanation, behind ethical rules, religion gives comfort to people. To all of you, the question is, what do you think is possible philosophy in kindergarten to be opening or open mind of the young children, since without questions and ethics we couldn't get good citizens. Thank you.
We haven't mentioned narrative and how that relates to virtue, but it's interesting that an appeal to virtue is quite a rich territory at the moment in my understanding of how theological ethics can have quite a fruitful conversation with secular ethics or philosophy via an appeal to the pursuit of virtue. But then I think from a theological perspective, you come to a point where you have to say, well, is there a narrative here that is worth living by? And in terms of engaging with the kindergarten, of course, one of the great gifts of the Christian tradition is that it is full of amazing stories, and they are stories that appeal and can be grasped and grappled with, whether you are at the level of an academic seminar or whether you're at the level of engaging a group of 3 or 4-year-olds. And I think the richness of conveying this is the story that we inhabit, that we take our place within. It's a story that is robust enough to face all questions, and yet it is a story worth living by, worth shaping a life by. It seems to me one of the things that, ironically, in the media culture that we live in, is one of the best selling points of Christianity, because everyone is so desperate to tell their story and to emphasise the inherent worth of their own story via their Instagram feed or their Twitter or their Facebook or whatever. But actually here is a story that can be not only appealing, but it's a story that you can take your place within. So I think there are huge challenges, but I think that actually the kind of the basic narrative of Christianity need not feel threatened by these new ways of telling the story.
I'll just make, again, one comment, which is that probably already known that the Auckland Institute for Faith and Culture is publishing again this week a book by a now dead, but very well-known Oxford academic C.S. Lewis, who I'm sure people have heard of, at least because of the Narnia stories and everything else, but a small book by him called The Abolition of Man, which addresses absolutely directly the question that you've just asked about how do we, inculcate, within young children, these values and a positive vision of what it is to be human, a positive division of society. And he's precisely pushing back against a form of education that just wants to be purely sort of critical and purely sort of intellectual in a very puffed up and proud way, and just always cutting down everybody's values and beliefs and arguing that actually that is what makes us human, and we need those things and we need them to be built in from the beginning. So I think certainly, as Christopher's already said, there is a renewed sense, I think, within theology and philosophy, but also within education, certainly in Britain and the United Kingdom, that actually, you need people who are both ready as persons to receive teaching and also are prepared as persons to actually be able to make positive use of that when they go out into the world, as much as you just need to try and transfer this information from here to here. And so the way in which people are formed, the ethics of education, the ethics of the development of children and young people is hugely being talked about. But that actually, although written in the 1940s, the book by C.S. Lewis actually I think is a very exciting and challenging and fruitful engagement with precisely that question.
May I ask you a question more? Do you mean that British and other governments are afraid of putting ethics in education, since children could be more wise and more ethical, and they'll judge the government?
Yeah, that's entirely possible. That could be quite scary.
Thank you for the question, and we have time for one last question. I think that somebody, did you raise your hand?
It's not really a question.
Okay, so it will be the last response, the last comment or question.
Oh, I was just going to ask Dr. Risto if he could elaborate on what he said, one of a Russian philosopher, I think, that art starts where nature stops in the Revelation. Could you just elaborate?
Well, I think it's a matter of it's not a matter of hierarchy about art, because nature stops when spirit begins. Because with the human creation, the spirit enters into the history. And that's why I think that we could find the Hegelian heritage in those kind of thoughts. But they are not only Hegelian. So nature creates human being to open the world for human spirit, and then human spirit continued the same creation in terms of art, because the nature doesn't have artworks. I don't know, maybe some house of ants. It's very complicated, but it is not form of art because it doesn't have spirit in the house of ants. But this in art forms we have invest the human spirit, and the human spirit, it's some kind of effect of nature creation. So they are connected somehow. But when nature stops, simply nature stops because it creates human being, and then the human being will continue the creation. The nature simply stops there because it fulfill its aim, create the human being. Because maybe I'm referring now on Terre de Chardin about the anthropogenesis is the crown of cosmogenesis, but because they are these Russian philosophers, they are religious philosophers, and they have in mind the same thing of Terre de Chardin. But just shortly with this comment about philosophy in kindergarten, I think that we're going to invest a lot of, we're going to invest the continuation of humankind, because with the philosophy in kindergarten, we ensure their freedom, the freedom of humankind, because they are free, the children are free, but with the philosophy, we are assuring their freedom. So I think that this is the way that the art and philosophy are connected, because also in artworks, the people are free. That's why, because the nature is not free. But in artworks we are free. So nature just creates the topos in itself to create freedom. And she creates freedom in humankind. And that's why the artworks are the works of human freedom, not of laws of nature. So that's how I understand this phrase of Russian philosopher Solomon.
We are right on time to give the final word. First, I would like to thank our guests from Britain, from Great Britain, coming to this house of the EU, and being our guests of the Philosophical Society of Macedonia. Thanks to everybody who contributed, so we already gave the credits. We hope you will have a good stay further in Macedonia, and we inform our regular guests who will come to the Christian Philosophical Forum that we are preparing the next session of the forum in approximately 3 to 4 weeks. We will get some additional information on it. So thanks once again, and hope to see you soon again.